So, Joy, it's been a few months since we sat down to discuss some of these global factors that are impacting Huawei's business in the United States. So, I wanted to take some time to kind of catch up with you and really get an understanding of some of the broader implications that all this has, not just to Huawei, but to the larger ecosystem of telecom suppliers, but just the economy in general. So, to provide just a little bit of background, US officials are working to block Huawei out of the US market. That has an impact on carrier sales, but there's also been some machinations around cutting off access to US based suppliers. At the same time, the US is trying to influence their allies to do the same thing in other geographies. So I just want to understand the economic implications. So maybe we can start with Huawei. Your U.S.-based R&D subsidiary recently conducted a round of layoffs. So help me understand what the impact's going to be internally to Huawei and then also to these suppliers that Huawei sends so much business to.
Thank you, Sean. The human impact is really big. Our U.S. teammates are smart, hardworking people who are essential to Huawei's success. Because U.S. government has put Huawei on the entity list, we had to lay off 600 hardworking Americans from our R&D division. We have been in these communities like Plano, Santa Clara, Bridgewater, New Jersey for many years. That's the last thing we wanted to see happen. Huawei planned to invest $600 million in the US for research and development in 2019. The government's action forced us to put all these plans on hold because there's simply too much uncertainty around who we can work with and what research projects we can conduct in the US. That's why we hope the government can clarify the status for Huawei and for our suppliers as well as soon as possible. That way, we can continue to provide secure technologies for our rural operators. We can continue to buy goods and services from US suppliers and bring some stability back to the market.
Joy, I also wanted to get your perspective. Recently, a lot of Huawei's US suppliers, Intel, Micron, some others, were in Washington to meet with White House officials about how restrictions against Huawei are impacting their own bottom line. So what's your take on that when a US company is telling a US government that what you're doing is hurting us?
These businesses are absolutely right. The Washington's actions are actually hurting US businesses, not just the large corporations like Intel, Qualcomm, but small and medium-sized companies too. So many companies along the value chain will be impacted directly or indirectly. Each year, Huawei procures $11 billion of goods and services in the US. That's a significant source of income for many companies. Because of the entity list, it can potentially affect 50,000 jobs and families and their abilities to pay the bills. Since the entity list, a lot of our suppliers actually reduced their financial forecast for the year. You have seen the Qualcomm result this morning. That's a perfect example. Many shareholders around the world are getting impacted. And it also impacts our ongoing research projects and our suppliers' research projects. So we'll start seeing the ripple effect very soon if the situation continues. That's why we hope the government can resolve the supply chain issue in a timely manner. But even with all this, Huawei's business continues to thrive. We have just announced our first half financial results. Revenue was up 23% year over year. Going forward, we'll continue to work very hard to address all the challenges.
So Joy, a lot of the relevant rhetoric and policy decisions in Washington are couched around this idea of 5G as a race that the US needs to win. One of the pending pieces of legislation in the Senate right now is essentially subsidy funding for rural and regional operators that use Huawei equipment. It would loan them the money to rip that equipment out and replace it with something from a different vendor. So I'm curious to get your perspective on if that goes forward, what would that mean for Huawei? What would that mean for those rural operators? And maybe most importantly, what would it mean for their customers?
First of all, 5G is not a race. We're at the beginning stage of 5G deployment around the world. Many countries are having their own plans on the infrastructure deployment. But the real impact comes after the infrastructure is available and when the vertical industries and consumers start benefiting from the infrastructure. So it's a long game, and it should not be considered as a race. US does not have domestic 5G infrastructure vendor, but it does have strong telecom operators and vertical industries. They can reap huge economic benefit from the 5G technology. However, if the US governments start preventing private sectors from making their own decisions, the results will not be good. In this case, Washington's action will hurt US rural operators and the hardworking Americans who rely on these rural operators. Large companies like AT&T and Verizon do not serve some parts of the US. These areas are too remote and too sparsely populated. They cannot make money. So if you're out in Montana or East Oregon, if you want to make a 911 call, the only reason the call goes through is because of Huawei's equipment. Schools, hospitals, farms, and businesses, they all rely on Huawei for connectivity. Washington thinks Huawei is a threat, but they have not provided any evidence to that. Now they might force these small rural operators to take Huawei's gear out of their network and replace them with more expensive equipment, which is not made by any American companies. Experts say government's order to rip and replace could take as long as 7 years, and it will cost these rural operators more than $1 billion. That's a lot of money these rural operators do not have. So I would be very interested in seeing the numbers along the economic impact when these customers cannot afford to pay broadband services. That's the ripple effect. Charles River Associates, a consulting firm based in Boston, estimates banning Huawei from the 5G market in the US will shrink US GDP by $241 billion over the next 6 years. $241 billion, that's a huge number. And they also estimate the current cell towers and radio access equipment already cost 15% more than it would if Huawei were allowed in the US market.
As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. has been trying to exert pressure on some of its allies, particularly in Europe, to follow suit and block Huawei out of the market. That hasn't really materialized, and I think there's some compelling numbers from your first half of the year financial results that speak to that, right?
Yes, we haven't seen any indications of Huawei being blocked in Europe. In fact, Huawei has signed 50 5G commercial contracts around the world. 28 of them are in Europe. US is trying to pressure its allies into banning Huawei, but many European operators have been working with Huawei for 15 years. They understand Huawei has innovative technologies and they trust Huawei. They are approaching the cybersecurity issues much more rationally and logically. They want to manage risks through testing mechanisms proven to be effective. The economics are very simple. If you take out one of the major players in the market, there will be less competition. Less competition means higher prices and lower quality. Experts say banning Huawei in Europe will add $62 billion into the cost of 5G deployment. And in the US, that number will be even bigger since our prices are already higher here than in Europe. Those higher costs will be eventually passed on to consumers. So, for example, $33 in the US will get you 10 gigabits of data. And depending on where you live, your download speed may not be that high. For the same amount of money, in Germany, you'll get 30 GB, in Italy, 60 GB, and in the UK and France, 100 GB. So that's why countries that want to introduce 5G technology to benefit their consumers and businesses should not ban an industry leader like Huawei. There's a reason Huawei is 12 to 18 months ahead of its competition in 5G. It's because we have spent over 10 years and $2 billion working on it.
And so, Joy, you mentioned cybersecurity. In the US, whether real or perceived, that is the underlying issue, is this concern about cybersecurity and about Huawei's relationship with the Chinese government. So just lay it out for me. What is Huawei's relationship with the Chinese government, if any? And then if you could tell us a little bit about some of the measures Huawei takes internally and in partnership with their customers to ensure cybersecurity.
Okay, so let me talk about Huawei's relationship with the Chinese government first. Huawei started in China as one of the largest telecom companies. It comes in contact with the Chinese government. It is true for any tech company in any country. But Huawei doesn't have any special relationship with the Chinese government. The government has no ownership in Huawei, and they do not interfere with Huawei's business operation in any way. So the US government thinks Huawei is based in China, it can be manipulated by the Chinese government. There's absolutely no evidence to that. When our founder, Mr. Ren, started a company when he was 43, he simply wanted to make a living. And over the years, with all the employees' hard work, Huawei has become an industry leader. But if you ask those employees, they're just engineers and researchers who want to provide a good living for their families while developing cool products and technologies. They're just like employees here in the US and in any other country. So Huawei is not a proxy of the Chinese government. And let me talk about the security of the equipment. Huawei has been in this business for 30 years, and we're working with over 500 operators around the world. We serve 200 out of the top Fortune 500 companies. And every day, our technologies support over 3 billion people. And we open ourselves up for scrutiny by governments, operators, and third parties so that they can come in and test our equipment, make sure they're not compromised. So we have a lot of eyes on the company. And without a doubt, Huawei is really the most scrutinized company in the world. And we have not seen any evidence of foul play by anyone. So we don't really understand the basis of the allegations from the US government. Digital network is more vulnerable for hacking and cybercrime. That is true for any equipment vendor, not just Huawei. To address that threat, we need coordinated effort by equipment manufacturers, operators, and users. So we need to develop a universal objective standard for mitigating risks. So for example, 3GPP and GSMA has launched a security framework. So with that, you can test wireless equipment made by Huawei or any other vendor. Using mechanisms like that, we can really make decisions around security. And these decisions will be based on facts, not emotions or political rhetoric.
Yeah, no, it's interesting from my perspective as 5G ramps up, this security question becomes more prominent. In the US, the question is just security related to Huawei. Then you see countries like Germany, they take a very serious approach to cybersecurity for 5G and apply it to every single vendor that's going to take part, which I think is a much more pragmatic approach, which kind of just puts me into my last question here is this entire issue, is it about Huawei and is it about Huawei's technology, or is it about the US and China relationship and geopolitics?
I think this is a very complicated multi-layer issue. There is certainly technology competition as well as geopolitics. Some US politicians want to use Huawei as a proxy of China and a target to attack to advance their political interests. But Huawei does not want to be a bargaining chip, and we should not be a bargaining chip. We hope over time we can set the record straight and people can understand Huawei is just a simple and honest company that wants to connect the world and bring intelligence to the world.
So, Joy, there's a lot of discussion in DC, as you mentioned, about what's next in terms of how Huawei is going to relate to the U.S. market. To what extent does Huawei take part in these discussions? If I was a politician that was genuinely interested in this topic, I would want to have a meaningful engagement with Huawei. Is that happening?
We haven't been able to have the conversation at the level we wanted to have. We certainly want to engage with U.S. lawmakers. The goal would be to address their concerns and to create a framework that protects the networks and their users. And we definitely want that to happen.